with that, that brings me to our wonderful speaker this evening. So we have Fred Rumsey with us. Fred spent most of his working life at the Natural History Museum in London, going from postdoc to UK biodiversity researcher and ultimately senior curator in charge of British fern and historic herbaria. He acts as a general fern referee for the BSBI alongside a range of flowering plant families, such as butterworts, because I asked Fred about a butterwort identification question earlier this year, and he's also been president of the British Pteridological Society. He has interests in biogeography and conservation, co-authoring the GB and England vascular plant red lists and the European fern red list. Fred has told me that he keeps promising a comprehensive British and Irish fern flora, but until then, we'll have to make do with this webinar on this one small, fascinating group. And so with that, I hand over to Fred.
Thank you very much, James. Let me just share my screen. Whoops, where are we going? Oh gosh.
That's brilliant.
Technology. What a wonderful thing. Come on. Whoops. Let's go back. Start. There we go. So, right. So tonight it's lovely to have the opportunity to introduce people to this particularly, I think, fascinating group of very ancient plants, and it's fair to say I'm going to be covering the whole of Britain and Ireland, and not just Ireland, though thanks to Ireland for funding this series. So this group of plants, the Clubmosses, consists of two main terrestrial orders, if you like, that we're going to deal with tonight: the Lycopodiales and the Selaginellales. That's a mouthful, isn't it? And the other group within this group of primitive plants are the largely aquatic quillworts, the Isoetales, which we're not going to be dealing with tonight. So we can see here the current sort of classification of these groups. Certainly, when I first started out as a young botanist, the Lycopodiaceae just contained Lycopodium virtually, and over the years, various things have been split off and recognised, and because of the very primitive and very ancient divisions of these lineages, it's been suggested that it's much more appropriate to recognise things at this much greater level. So things that were, hitherto Lycopodiums are now in completely separate subfamilies, and these subfamilies and the British and Irish plants actually are fairly well represented through this broad spread of the Clubmosses. As I've shown here, the actual believed divergence time, that the last common ancestor between the Lycopodiums and the Selaginellas was over 380 million years ago. So that's way back in the Devonian. So these are hugely old lineages which haven't changed very much over time. And this group of the lycophytes are microphyllous plants. So they have very simple leaves which are just have a single unbranching vein within them. And of course, they are spore-bearing plants, and we'll go on to look at some of the differences between those spore-bearing structures, which are extremely important. Now, molecular work has recognised these various different genera and monophyletic groups within these big orders and families, and has suggested that the splitting up of these, and that certainly happened already with the Lycopodiaceae, And it looks like it probably will happen with the Selaginellas as well. So currently we have just this one genus, which has got this huge number of species, 750 of them. But as I say, recent work has suggested that it's possibly better if we split this into 19 different genera, and that may well have sort of nomenclatural and other complications, which I'll go on to. So here we go. The primary difference between the Selaginellas and the Lycopodiums, if I can centulata, if I call them that, is the fact that the Lycopodiums are homosporous, i.e. they just produce one sort of spore, which when it germinates produces a gametophyte upon which the male and female sexual organs are born. Whereas in the Selaginellas, they're heterosporous. So they produce two different sorts of spores. Megaspores, which contain go on to form the female structures, and microspores. And these can be arranged in various ways upon the plant. But in sort of leading towards this sort of system, this heterospore system, you begin to start to see the way that the sort of flowering plants and other things will later go on to do. It's a sort of primitive form of what say becomes later flowers and other systems. So it's really quite a distinct difference. And the last slide showed you that there were lots of different genera now being recognised within the Lycopodiums. Within British Isles and Ireland, we have these 5 genera recognised by the Pteridophyte phylogeny group now, although not necessarily by Clive Stace and our sort of standard British flora. And I can sort of talk about some of those changes as we go through. So to bring you to the first one, this is Selaginella, Selaginoides, the lesser club moss, one of the most gorgeous little plants. Usually grows in fairly calcareous upland, often flush conditions, but also is sometimes to be found in dune slacks and systems, particularly towards the more sort of northern ends of its range. It's an easy plant to overlook as it looks rather mossy. It's the most mossy of the club mosses, if you like, and it's easily told apart from those by obviously the sporing structures, the microspores and the megaspores, which sit in the axils of the leaves, and the leaves have got a much sort of thicker texture than a moss would have, and these very clear dentate sort of projections, spiny projections along the margins of the leaf. So here we can see the sporing structures sitting in the leaf axils. Each of the leaves also has a little tiny ligule, and those ligules are probably quite important in the early stages of the production of the plant, tips of the plant, because they help absorb water, and they also produce a sort of mucilaginous substance which can protect those growing tips. So, as I said, the Selaginella may be split up into 19 different genera, and Selaginella selaginoides is the type species of the genus Selaginella, which you think, oh, that's great for us. The problem is most Selaginellas don't look like ours. It is one of only 2 species which has this sort of growth form, with leaves which are very similar throughout. The other one, Selaginella deflexa, is only found on Hawaii. And as a consequence, if you do split up the genus, and this would by necessity become Selaginella, all of the other genera, which are much more numerous, much more, you would think, globally sort of typical, would need new names. So it has been suggested that were that to happen, a conserved type in one of these other bigger subject, what are now sort of subgenera, could be used as the new type of Selaginella. If that were to be the case, then our little plant here would then end up being called Selaginoides spinulosa. But unless that gets agreed through various sort of botanical congresses and things, we are still this situation where it's still Selaginella. So this is our distribution map, and you can see this is clearly an upland species, and we'll see similar patterns as we go through the distribution maps that I'll show you throughout this talk. And you can see in places sort of coastal distribution as well. As I said, it's sometimes found in dune slacks, but mainly it's a montane species which has never been in lowland England, although suspiciously we've got a dot somewhere down here in London, so probably in Mick Crawley's garden or something like that. The maps I'll show you in all cases, I've put them up as the pre-2000, post-2000 split, because I think that actually is quite an interesting and intriguing way to look at a lot of these things and see the levels of decline and the sort of levels of decline that relate to the things that we've been reporting in the latest red list. 2000 seems like a nice sort of cut-off date to think about before and after. So it's not the only Selaginella selaginoides is our only native species, but it's not the only Selaginella you might find out in the countryside. And this one, Selaginella kraussiana, is a much more sort of typical plant in that you have this sort of heterophily. So the lateral leaves are a rather different shape and size to the ones which are above them on the stems. And this plant produces rhizophores, which are sort of neither roots nor stems. They're probably modified stems rather more than modified roots. Those whitish structures which come down from the shoots and into the substrate. This plant is a native to Macaronesia, to tropical Africa, but it's quite a weedy thing. And where it occurs now in Britain, let's have a little look at the map. Certainly, you can see this is definitely a spreading species. It's a species which is to be found. I often see it where I have seen it. It tends often to be in sort of damp, mossy grasslands, often in churchyards. Some of the Cornish examples I know where I've seen it are like that. And down the bottom here, this is a little plant of it which has popped up in some of my flower pots in the garden. It spreads itself around quite well that way. Like our native one, the sporangia are actually sort of quite explosive, and they ping away from the plant, so they can spread several meters with a good ping. And once fertilized, they produce these little tiny sort of plantlets to start with, which then grow out to cover the ground. So there, the gametophytes are held within that sort of spore structure, and the little plant develops from that. And as we'll see, that's rather different from the situation with the lycopods as we go on. So coming on to the sort of what I think of more as the true Clubmosses, the Lycopodiaceae. Here we've got a nice sort of montane scene with Hupertia, the fir club moss, in amongst lots of Racemytrium and Festuca vivipara, sort of standard, classic sort of montane situation where you've got, you often find these club mosses really love being on this sort of glacial moraines, the sort of stirred up bits of disturbed land, which they seem to thrive on. So using this a Lycopodia as an example here, these are really, as I say, very different from the Selagian, in that they just produce one sort of spore. The spores land, grow into sort of chunky little structures. In this case, you can see that top picture A. It's sort of a sort of small sort of ball of tissue which contains on its upper surface the various sexual organs, and these, with all of these Lycopodiaceae, these structures are very heavily reliant on mycorrhizal associates. In Lycopodiella, they form near to or on the surface of the substrate, whereas with the other species that we'll look at, the other genera, they are subterranean. So they're like little tiny sort of white sort of parsnips, probably less than a centimetre long, underground. And once fertilised, they produce these little structures which go on to grow into these sort of rather larger spreading patches, and in this case the strobili, the spore-bearing structures sticking up from them. Here are some pictures of these sort of small sort of subterranean carroty type constructions, which are the meatphytes of some of the others, in this case the Diphasiastrums, the alpine club moss, with the section organs borne up on the top there, and then sort of the developing plant coming up from that. So to look at perhaps for many of the club moss that you're most likely to bump into, this is Hupertus salago, the fir club moss. This picture was taken in on the BSBI's meeting in Killarney a year or two back. You can see it's sort of actually associated with a filmy fern there, which is not necessarily that typical. But you can see here this is a sort of dichotomously branching structure, which looks rather like a sort of robust example of some of the sort of polytrichum type mosses that you can find, but obviously differs from the mosses in that the spore-bearing structures are in these little sort of pouches which are in the axils of the leaves. We can see from the map again that this is essentially a sort of a more montane thing, but you can see from the pink squares, which are the past records, the pre-2000 records, that it was once at least widely spread through lowland England as well, usually on very wet heathland, bogs, those sorts of areas, growing in mires where there's sort of running water and sphagnum. But all of these sort of certainly more easterly and southern locations have largely been lost now. It does still just about manage to hang on Exmoor and sort of Dartmoor, Bodmin down there, and still on the Lizard as well. But we are even there losing this rather more boreal plant from lowland England. It's quite a variable thing, and we got three separate examples here. Quite often we find in more upland boreal stressed situations that plants are a more yellowish green colour. Now, whether that actually reflects just the edaphic situation and the nutrient status or whether it's a slightly more sort of profound taxonomic difference, I think is something which we are still working on. And there is a fair amount of work which does sadly still need to be done to fully understand Rupertia in Europe and the British Isles and Ireland. And we're sort of slowly sort of getting there as we do more molecular work and looking at in more detail at these structures. I think, as with so many plants which look so distinctive, you think, well, there's nothing else to confuse that with. You therefore don't bother to look at them in any great detail. And once you start looking at some of these things in detail, you realize there are subtle differences there. So with Rupertia, one of the things to look for, which always helps sort of point it out, are the fact it produces these gemmi, these sort of are born in whorls, usually just a single, sometimes two whorls, and they terminate each year's growth. So by looking back down through the plant, you can see 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 4 year, and you can go on, and you can this way you can age plants quite nicely. But the shape of the gemmi, where the gemmi are forming, potentially do tell us rather more taxonomically, we think, as well. So there's been now some sort of cytometric studies done in Central Europe, and some of that work is now extending further into other parts of the world. But instead of there being just one single sort of cytotype on ploidy race within Britain and Europe, we actually know that we have diploids, triploids, tetraploids, pentaploids, and hexaploids in Central Europe. Now, there hasn't been as much sampling done in Britain yet, but it's obvious that we do have diploids and some pentaploids, but most of our plants that have been looked at so far are tetraploids, and that's also the most common race in Europe. Famously, I think Irene Manton, who was one of the first great sort of workers on the cytology of ferns, she discussed this plant, the Rupertia, as being one of the most abominable things to try to get chromosome counts from. All sorts of technical problems and very large number of chromosomes as well. So it's been a real struggle to do chromosome counting, and unfortunately now we've got sort of flow cytometry and other ways of looking at DNA amounts. It's an easier way to work out what ploidy races we've got. But clearly these different ploidy levels potentially could be recognized as different species. That does seem to be more frequent these days with the way we taxonomically treat things, because biologically they are distinct. Looking in space, you'll see the mention of Selago subspecies Arctica, and this has been the name which has been given to these rather distinctive, often pale yellowish boreal forms. It's true that Arctica isn't a British species, we think now. It's certainly something which was described from the sort of the Russian Arctic. It's possible that it is present in the high Arctic, but isn't here. But there is still a possibility that we do have other taxa here. So to start looking at some of these things, we can look at the different ploidy levels, and there are various sort of proxy ways of doing that. Quite often people look at spore size, but sometimes it's easier and actually more revealing to look at stomatal size. So it's tricky to look at the stomata on those little tiny microphyllous leaves of these things. But if you do that, you can see that there are sort of subtle differences, and certainly between the diploids, which you would expect to have the smallest stomata, and these higher ploidy levels, there is a clear difference, and that difference is also reflected in the size and shape of the gemi that the plant forms, as this picture shows. Now, these are the sort of plants that certainly I would have been calling Hupertius Senego subspecies arctica in the past. I think the thing which differentiates them is there's a juvenile phase fairly early on, sort of decumbent start to life, and that in that juvenile phase, before it starts producing any sorts of sporing structures or any sorts of gemi, the leaves are much longer, so the stem is broader, and you can sort of see that happening here as well. And then things taper down above. Down here, it's way down into the substrate where that juvenile phase is. But once the plant has switched to a fertile maturity, suddenly the microphyls are much smaller. And the other thing which happens is, instead of there being sort of annual growth rings with the gemi produced, it just sort of continuously produces gemi, much more obviously so in this plant from the serpentine debris on Unst, but also true of some of these others from the Scottish mountains. And it's potentially possible that these sorts of montane plants may be up on some of the higher Northern Irish and Southern Irish mountains as well. Well worth looking for. Now, whether these are actually the diploids that we've been hearing about, or whether this does represent a different species, I think the jury is still out. We still need to do more work on this, but there clearly are intriguing differences here. And then taxonomic and nomenclatural questions as to actually what we actually call these, because there are certainly some problems with some of the names which have been applied. So moving on to our next genus, this is like a Lycopodium, the marsh club moss. Similar to the last one, to the Hupertium in some ways, although clearly sort of where that was an upright plant, this one is definitely a ground hugger. It sort of creeps along. Always think of it like a sort of a rather sort of pronounced Dennis Healy type sort of green eyebrow. It loves these sticky black humic areas on sort of bits of lowland wet heath, but also I guess more typically for many people away from the south of England to be seeing this on sort of drawdown areas around lakes, particularly where you've got this sort of very peaty substrate, where you've got algal and sort of fungal sponges sort of going on, forming these sort of skins on the surface. And at the end of each growth period, at the end of each season, it effectively sort of burrows in to the ground. That's where the main root is, and then next year it will produce a shoot from that point and carry on sort of arching along and going. So here's our distribution map again, and again this is it's a bit of a shocker really, because we can see that there's obviously been a massive decline over the years. Now, how ancient some of that is debatable, but certainly in sort of central lowland England, it's just been lost, and again in many parts of Scotland as well. I guess it's never been as frequent a plant in Ireland, and it's held on in many of those areas, but certainly down in the southwest, it seems to have done very badly. Its main sort of centres, some of the heaths in sort of Surrey and up into Berkshire, but mainly in the New Forest. This is the real sort of headquarters of this thing. A few sites in the lakes and up in Snowdonia, and then off and on sort of old China clay waste around the pits down in Cornwall. But you see, there's been a very great loss of this species over time. It has these really rather nice sort of spiky, distinctive strabili, which the spore-bearing structures. As I say, it's got this sort of always this rather sort of bright yellowy green colour running around on the surface, forming quite extensive and dense patches. The most frequent, I think, possibly for many people, species is this one, Lycopodium clubatum, the stagthorn club moss, so called because these sort of very pronounced spore-bearing structures on long stalks. Got these lovely long, wispy hair points on the leaves, and this is sort of a long-running, creeping plant which sort of adopts a sort of guerrilla type strategy to finding new bits of patches of heathy ground to exploit. So it will send out long running shoots, put down roots, or try to put down roots where it can, and then sort of will then use that as a new centre and then go sort of shooting off in different directions again afterwards. Here's our comparable distribution map, and once again you can see that if you're a club moss lover like me and you're in southern England, then things are pretty desperate and miserable. Even more so because these last few records down in Surrey and Hampshire are all now gone. I suspect this one's a Sussex one. I think that's now gone as well. Some of the ones on Exmoor are gone. So it's a plant which seems to be retreating to the north, to the more boreal and upland situations. And intriguingly, it's never been a common plant in Ireland. In fact, none of the club mosses are as well represented there as you would think they ought to be, given lots of nice sort of heathy, peaty sort of soils that you'd think they would love. And I think some of these montane species, or the more montane species, have done badly in Ireland because it's just too warm in the winter on the Irish hills. I think these things need a period of cold to actually sort of turn them off, so that they sort of don't burn up what resources they have through the winter and then not be able to grow later on. Now, with all of these upland species of club moss, there are boreal equivalents, and these boreal equivalents have been recognised at varying different taxonomic levels. In some cases as full species, more often as some species, or even sometimes just as varieties. We saw that with the Hupertia. Some of the boreal forms had been called some species Arctic in the past, and say we think there are distinct ploidy and other differences there that may need to be recognised. But all these other species that we'll go on to look at have got boreal forms which are much more frequent in the Arctic, in up into Scandinavia and at higher levels. And the sort of boreal equivalent in Lycopodium is this plant, Lycopodium lagopus, which we sort of managed to overlook until sort of, I think it's about 2007, finally published something on this, recognising the fact that we had this plant in Scotland, which had been recognised earlier by Scandinavian workers, where it's obviously a much more frequent species. And so this thing grows at higher altitudes. It's very much a mountain species which occurs generally at a greater altitude than Clubmosses itself. It's recognised that it's a smaller, more stunted plant, but with these very distinctive upright sort of growth habit, and the stability, the cones are on much shorter stalks, usually only single, but occasionally sort of paired. But where they are paired, there aren't individual stalks to the branches. And we've got sort of pictures here from VC96, VC97 up on Scottish mountains, generally a shorter strabilis, and it has a different look to it, but clearly is a very closely related plant to the sort of the lowland form. If we look at that sort of peduncle length, you can see here that there is an area of overlap in this study that Andy Amphlett did, looking at some of these sort of Scottish examples. And I still struggle as to whether we should be recognizing this as a distinct species or as a subspecies. And I think possibly most days I would actually err on the side of subspecies now, because we do find intermediate plants. There aren't many characters which differentiate the two, so there aren't many ways of finding an intermediate. But I think that there's more molecular work which needs to be done here, and more studies generally are needed on this and in other of these interesting club moss problems. So a rare plant, and sadly one that the Irish don't have, at least we don't know you have yet, well worth looking for, is what Stace calls Lycopodium anatinum. Most others now are referring to, in a separate genus, as Spinulum anatinum, the interrupted club moss. Again, a plant which is very much more frequent in Scandinavia, so you'll find it in sort of boreal birch woodlands. And it's interesting that certainly there's this lowland record, I see lovely herbarium specimens from here, in an area of swampy birch, which was very reminiscent of woodlands that I've seen in northern Sweden. But the only English site currently now is this one, where we've got this picture taken up above Bow Fell in Langdale in the Lake District. So primarily a Scottish mountain species. There was, until about the 1830s, 1840s, a population down above Cwmidwal, on the slopes of the Gliders. So this is what it looks like in these sort of lovely sort of pine woodlands, birch, juniper, and you've got this sort of lovely green leggy thing, again looking rather like a polytrichum moss. Nice, you can see a creeping stem running all the way along here, setting up lots of these upright branches. It's sort of arching over, runs around. Same sort of guerrilla strategy, looking for sort of suitable areas to colonize that the Lycopodium clavatum has. And these sort of long leaves, which are sort of dentate or weakly dentate, generally on their margins, with a smallish, less pronounced hair point than we get on clavatum and lagopus. And of course, the other main distinguishing feature is the fact that the strabilis is completely sessile and it's just single. But as I say, this too has a boreal form. Subspecies alpestri, it used to be called subspecies dubium as well in some of the Scandinavian literature. And much like the sort of lagopus form of clavatum, it's a much more upright growing species, smaller microphylls, and also the strabili, the cones are much shorter. They tend to be about sort of half the length of those in the lowland forms of this. Again, as we saw with the Hupertia, these boreal forms tend to have a very different pigmentation. So they're a much more yellow-green colour. The leaves are a rather different shape, are held much more erect as well, not spreading. They tend to be almost sub-entire. And the annual growth bits are, instead of being sort of parallel sided, they tend to sort of start out smaller and then sort of come back to smaller again. So they're sort of rather ovoid little sections of annual growth. Now we're only just beginning to realise that we've got this distinct boreal form in Scotland. And I think part of the difficulties with recognising it has been because there are intermediate forms which are clearly sort of clouding the issue. So this picture here is that one English site. This is up below sort of Beaufort Buttress, with Jeremy Robertson's taken this picture. But you can see it's got quite a short strabilis, and this sort of shape to the annual growth and the colour is also somewhat reminiscent of the boreal form. This plant here was taken on the Sow of Atholl while I was sort of scurrying around desperately trying to find Phyllodes caerulea. And again, you see quite a short strabilis, but the colour is more like typical of our time. So we still need to experiment more with these to look more at where we've got intermediates, whether those intermediates are occurring at intermediate altitudes, and then hopefully get some molecular work done to see if these really are distinct and at what level we should be recognising them. But subspecies does seem to be quite a sensible way of doing this. So that moves us on to Diphasiastrum, to the alpine club moss. This has got a sort of rather sort of coniferous look to these sort of branches. Again, it's a long running rhizome which heads across, sends up these sort of little tufts of branches, usually a rather sort of glaucous blue-grey colour, smaller, less obvious, rather scale-like microphylls. And these, a little bit like the Solagina, are sort of arranged such that you've got sort of lateral and sort of ventral ones which are of a different shape, and that is itself quite a useful character when we start to try to tell the difference between the different Diphasiastrum species which occur elsewhere in Europe, but we also have some problems to deal with in this country as well. So the cones on these strabili are rather less obvious than they have been on some of these other ones that we've looked at. They sort of terminate the branches, and in the case of Diphasiastrum alpinum, they're sessile, and that again is a useful distinguishing character when looking at the other Diphasiastrums. So our map, and you can see with this one, it's clearly always been a montane upland plant with sort of very few excursions away from that. Sadly, we no longer have it on Exmoor. I think it's been a sort of 100 years or something like that, probably since it was last there, although it's still in the mountains in the south of Wales. Has always been a very scarce plant in Ireland of these sort of montane areas, generally rather acid screes and this sort of glacial debris on the sort of mountain sides, but very much more frequent in Scotland, the Lake District. But you can see here that most of the losses are around the edges. This range around the more southerly and lowland areas, and this plant again probably is sort of retreating upslope as our climate changes. But there is another diphasiastrum, and again, there's been sort of all sorts of problems over nomenclature and what we call this, which causes confusions. Apart from a record down in Gloucestershire, down near Woodchester, in the let's think, 1880s, on a very peculiar area where there's lots of sort of strange acid soils, diatomaceous earths, and things like this. Otherwise, this plant is just known from some of the areas in the Scottish Highlands up to sort of Canis in West Sutherland. And this is actually the result of the hybridization between the last plant we saw, Diphasiastrum alpinum, and Diphasiastrum complanatum, which is not otherwise known in Britain, and probably it's possible it never was in Britain, because these hybrids that form in Diphasiastrum have a fairly high degree of fertility, not just this one, but others between other species elsewhere in Europe. Probably sort of 60 to 70% fertile, and therefore they could spread as spores, and that probably seems more parsimonious as to how we've got this, rather than imagining that we had complanatum and that's completely gone, and all that we're left with are these few scattered examples of the hybrid. Now, the hybrid differs from alpinum in these rather sort of flatter, broader, usually more sort of yellow-green shoots. The strabili are stalked, although it's not a very long stalk, but there is a stalk to these. The actual sort of scale leaves that form the strabilis are a subtly different shape as well. But I think it's fair to say that it's really tricky to tell apart some examples of alpinum from these genuine Islari, in that if the alpinum is very sort of shady, it can be underneath a kaluna bush or something like that in a wettish environment. Its morphology can actually sort of mirror quite closely that of the Islari. I think the really important things to look at, because cones quite often aren't there, are the underleaves. In Islari, they are much like complanatum in that they are broadest at the base, and they sort of stand out a sort of 45-degree angle. In the alpinum, there's always a sort of knuckle that comes up and bends over. You can slightly see that in this rather tired herbarium specimen here. And there are sort of subtle differences as well in the shape of these lateral leaves, certainly the sort of the shady ones looking rather sort of etiolated, don't have the same sort of neat fit that the Islerai does. And there was one more as well. This is again is a species which seems to be retreating eastwards. It's a sort of steppe species, which is now being sort of largely lost, even from parts of Central Europe. The only British occurrence that we're really sort of commenced with were plants that were on heathland at Wagoner's Wells down on the Hampshire-Surrey border, where it was collected once in sort of the 1860s. And then for a very long time, that specimen was misidentified, initially as alpinum and then as Islerai. And then finally, I came along and sort of decided that it was this Tristachium. Sadly, the British material isn't fertile, so we don't have these very sort of dramatic multi-coned sporing structures. It's a very upright plant with again this sort of very glaucous colour typically, and the lateral and ventral leaves are almost identical. So the individual branches are rather sort of narrow and squarish, and the main running stems, which in our other species sort of come along the surface of the ground, in Tristachium are actually subterranean. The picture here you probably can't quite see behind us is of a specimen which potentially was from an overseas gathering that's got muddled up on a herbarium sheet, but it claimed to be probably from Ingleborough, although I say its provenance is heavily disputed. So really, that's all I wanted to say. I'm going to give you a few minutes to talk about things. I shall leave you with this rather glorious herbarium sheet. Well, say it's a bound volume. This is HS 54, Hans Sloane 54, from the Natural History Museum's historic collections. And here we've got representation of just about all of our species almost. This is the alpine club moss, the interrupted club moss, stag-song club moss, fir club moss, marsh club moss, and lesser club moss. And these were all remarkably collected by Edward Lloyd in Snowdonia in the late 1680s, and given by him as specimens to William Corton of London, who, when he died, bequeathed his collections to Hans Sloane, and they've been sort of lurking there in our care for the last 300 and whatever years. So with that, I say thanks to all of these people, Wilfred Alistair Headley, who first introduced me to club mosses, really, and the many others who've helped me look at these fascinating plants over the years. And with that, say I shall shut up, stop sharing, and be available to answer any questions you've got.
That was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much, Fred. Absolutely gripping. So first question from Monica, I think just double checking. So are these the only species we have in Britain and Ireland? And then one of them, the Krause's club moss, isn't native?
That's it. Yes. Yeah. So all of the others are native, and it's just that one Selaginella which is non-native. There are, as we've seen with that Diphasiastrum, there are other species which we may have had in the past. There are a few more species out there in sort of continental Europe, but not many. So we've got a goodly representation of what's around in Europe, really. There are one or two other related species in the Micronesian islands. So down on Madeira and the Azores, there's an additional Diphasiastrum and uh, two different sort of Hupertia-like things. Um, but other than that, we do pretty well, really. And I guess there are some other species of Selaginella which people may grow, often indoors as sort of resurrection plants and things like that. But not many things I think that will would survive outside. So we're not likely to get too many other sort of invasives or things that you're going to come across.
Well, I was interested because I've seen something that kind of up until this evening I assumed was Krause's club moss in various kind of hot houses and so on. I've just suddenly wondered whether there could be other similar species in hot houses and so on that could one day move outside as well.
Yeah. I suspect most of them, let's say, wouldn't make it through some of our harsh winters, but there are potentially quite a range of things which are found in montane parts of the New World, which if they were introduced here, they could survive. Um, there's certainly, if you go to some of the better sort of collections, glasshouse collections, I think places like the sort of up at the Kibble Palace, up in Glasgow and in Edinburgh, there are very extensive collections under glass of some really amazing Selaginellas, and some of these sort of I can remember some of the ones in Wisley as well, where you've got these sort of amazing sort of iridescent ones. You've got this sort of sheen, which is all part of they're actually created not by pigments, but by the sort of physical structure of the cells.
Amazing. We've got a question from Jim McIntosh. I'm glad you could join us, Jim. He says, nice talk and thank you. What is the process by which lycopods are losing ground and retreating northwards?
I think there's probably various things. I think they're being affected like a lot of species which are heavily mycorrhizal. I think that there are losses there because of pollution and things happening underground that we're just not aware of. They clearly are species which do benefit a lot of them from a good cold winter. And I think that's partly, as I sort of allude to it, it's the fact that they need to shut down over that winter period. They don't sort of have the reserves to get them through if they're sort of still burning what little they've got, and at the same time aren't managing to grow and photosynthesize as much as they need. So I think warmer winters is causing the loss of plants from sort of lower altitudes and from the warmer southern sort of places. But the exact sort of physiological causes of some of these things, I think, is just sort of wild speculation on my part. But it certainly seems to be that things are sort of retreating in that sort of way.
Interesting.
I guess there's losses as well, just through sort of management. In the south, the sort of the decent sort of very sort of heathery heathlandy bits, things. I think possibly. Well, I know thinking of those last few examples in Surrey, they used to be, and Hampshire, they used to be very close to where I lived in Aldershot on some of the ground around there, and the clavatum came up there when the heathland was disturbed, when they were putting in a new series of lights for Farnborough Aerodrome on the adjacent bit of heath, and the plants came up probably from a long buried spore bank. Those spores would have germinated. Little plants came up, but within 5 years they were gone because we had a series of sort of droughts during the summer, and it's nice and disturbed and open, which has allowed them to come up, but they've then got no shade or shelter, and they got absolutely fried. And the same was true of the ones in Surrey as well. So I think there is the potential for these things to come back, but they they can't make the most of it. They can't sort of thrive in the sort of conditions they're now experiencing.
That's very interesting. Jim asks, do you think a lack of snow cover could also have a detrimental effect? You were talking about winter temperatures.
Yeah, it's possible that the snow beds do potentially play a part, whether they sort of actually in some cases keep things warm, or I don't know. I think certainly as well that you tend to find that some management practices like muir burn, um, that can really affect club moss populations, um, depending on the intensity of the burn. Again, if you've got sort of spores or little gametophytes down in a layer just below the surface, if that's not burnt through, then they'll be able to pop up and exploit the environment. But if that burn continues and kills those things off in the upper layers, then that could potentially have quite a sort of problem. So you'll find on some of those intensively managed sort of grouse moors and things like that, the club mosses will be on the paths and things like that, which are the non-burnt bits and away from the sort of vast tracts of land which have been more heavily managed.
Excellent, thank you. I'm conscious we've gone past 8 o'clock, so we'll do one more, and then I think that we'll wrap up. Ian Scott asks, where in the world has the greatest species richness of club mosses?
Probably the Andes or somewhere like that. There's certainly a lot of the sort of Rupertia phlegmariurus, which are the sort of often the new world equivalents of the Rupertias. Seen pictures of some of these amazing things up on the sort of those lost world tepui, where the some of the most amazing carnivorous plants are as well. They're very rich in species. So I guess probably those montane areas in South America.
Amazing. Right. Well, we've gone past 8 o'clock. Thank you again for that, Fred. It was absolutely fantastic. Loads. I mean, I'm fascinated by the kind of the diploid, tetraploid, pentaploid fir club mosses and what that might mean for the future. Hearing about, our lost, what was it, Tristachium?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely fantastic. Yeah, brilliant, fascinating stuff. Much more for me to go and read up on and learn more about. And I'm sure that's true for our entire audience. So thank you ever so much for your time this evening.